In today's presentation, I'm hoping to accomplish two things. One, I would like to somewhat demystify the process of historical research so that you, as audience members, can use digital tools at your disposal to embark on a public history project similar to mine if you are so inclined. And two, I would like to share what I've learned about Seattle's first settlers from the Ottoman Empire. I have lived in Seattle for 3 years now, and one of the highlights of my first year at UW was the Sephardic tour of Seattle. We boarded a bus at the UW Seattle campus and then drove to Pike Place, the Central District, and Seward Park to visit Sephardic shops, synagogues, schools, and homes that have constituted Seattle's Sephardic community for the past century. We heard not only from our tour guide, but also from rooted members of the community who shared stories of growing up in Seattle in the middle of the century and pointed out their childhood homes to us. Our tour ended at Bikur Holim with students and community members sharing food and conversation around circular tables. And this tour was what sowed the seed of my interest in the history of Seattle's Sephardic community. But then fast forward to last summer when the pandemic disrupted my plans to visit archives in Israel for research on Ottoman Jews. I was looking for a research project that I could pursue remotely when my advisor, Devin Nar, whom many of you know, suggested a digital mapping project on the history of Seattle's Sephardic community. He pointed out that historical census information was digitized and available online through Ancestry.com, and the end product of my research, a map, would also be remotely accessible, which was so important and newly relevant in the pandemic. So I began first by defining the scope of whom I would be studying. My dissertation research focuses on relationships across different ethnic groups in the Ottoman Empire, particularly the triangulation of identity among Armenians, Jews, and Turks. I wanted to adopt that same model for this project to focus not only on Sephardic Jews, but also on other groups that made the same journey from the Ottoman Empire to Seattle. And for that reason, I decided to focus my research on people listed as born in Turkey. Later on, I could expand to other geographies and include countries like Syria, Greece, Armenia, Lebanon, and Egypt, and so forth, which were changing over the course of this time. Another decision I had to make before I started my research was the historical scope of the map. Census data more recent than 1940 is only available in aggregated anonymous form, so I knew that I would be looking at the period preceding 1940. But as for the beginning point, I knew that Sephardic migrants began arriving in the first few decades of the 20th century, but I was not sure how far back I would need to go. So I began digging into the archives of Ancestry.com. Next slide. Great. Here, it is worth noting the process through which I tried to discern people's identities through the census records. The US Census form was not designed to capture the complexity of religious, ethnic, and linguistic identities in the Ottoman Empire. All of the people I studied were listed as white under race, and although some years the census did ask what language respondents spoke, other years it was only a question of whether or not they spoke English. Nevertheless, in the additional notes and markers made by hand, we can see evidence of either census workers or the respondents themselves writing their complex identities into this document. Under place of birth, the census worker would sometimes simply write Turkey, but other times would include additional qualifiers such as Tur Turkish, Tur Yiddish, Tur Greek, and so forth. Geographical qualifiers were also included at times, such as Tur Europe or Tur Asia Minor. Respondents' names may also reveal their ethnic background, but the prevalence of spelling errors can make it difficult to parse names and therefore identities. And here on the screen, you can see a sample from 1910, where I've marked out Lizzie Cohen, who is listed as having been born in Turkey and being Turkish. Before 1900, I could only find 3 Turkey-born settlers in Seattle. The first two, a woman named M. Abraham and a man named Nasser Khalil were both listed as peddlers, which was a common profession for Arab Christian immigrants from Mount Lebanon. The third was Emma Yosenhans, whose American-born parents were missionaries in Turkey, likely working to convert Orthodox Armenians to Protestantism in central Turkey, and whose architect husband would design many buildings on the University of Washington's Seattle campus. By the time Washington Territory became Washington State in 1889, Emma remained in Seattle, while Nasser and M. Abraham had either moved on or passed away. By the 1900 census, there had been a slight bump in Turkey-born settlers. There were a total of 17 people listed as born in Turkey, 6 of whom belonged to the same Melki family. Most of these settlers were likely Lebanese and held working and middle-class occupations, including a waiter, a storekeeper, a hotel cook, a day laborer, a peddler, and a cigar merchant. There were also 3 Jews in the first wave of Turkey-born settlers, whose parents were all originally from Russia. In the first decade of the 20th century, there was a huge explosion in migration from the Ottoman Empire to Seattle, which you can see in this graph of the screen. The 1910 census listed 548 Seattle residents as having been born in Turkey, representing an over 3,000% increase from the previous census. Only 65 of these residents, or just over 10%, were women. The majority of the women who had migrated were Jewish, followed by Syrian, Greek, and Armenian women, all of whom were listed as the daughters, wives, mothers, nieces, sisters, and sisters-in-law of the heads of house, which was a specific census designation. Of all the women recorded in the census, only 1 Jewish woman, Lizzie Cohen, who you saw on the previous screen, was classified as a lodger, with servant listed as her occupation. Along with 2 other Jewish women listed as dressmakers, Lizzie was one of the few women to undertake paid labor that was recorded in the census. 2 other exceptional women were Anna Joseph and Asma Ablan, a Syrian and Syrian, who were the only women listed as heads of household by the census. In the context of settler colonial societies, the gender ratio is often an indication of how long a group intends to stay in a certain location. Men were frequently employed as transient workers without any expectation of settling permanently. But if they devoted the additional resources to bringing their families with them, this was a sign that they intended to settle down long term. The immigration years listed among families in the census corroborate this trend. Fathers or sons would come first, and wives, mothers, and daughters would later follow. The relatively high ratio of Jewish women among the first wave of migrants could indicate a more common intention among this group to remain in Seattle. And here you can see a density map of all of the 1910 Turkey-born settlers in Seattle. Respondents with Jewish names were sometimes listed with the qualifier Yiddish, and other times as Turkish, even sometimes as Spanish. The Turkish designation was also at times used for Greek and Armenian names. This might have been an attempt to make themselves legible to the government entity collecting information, and it is difficult to say whether the distinction was made by the respondents themselves or by the census worker collecting information. But it does indicate some identification with the Ottoman geography and cultural space, rather than solely an identification with one's own linguistic or ethnic group. I was particularly interested in these categories because I wanted to see how much overlap there was in where these groups chose to settle. I found little tendency overall to cluster in specific areas, with the exception of some Jews who began settling around the Central District. And actually, this is an image I added later on, but here you can see it's a similar density map, but this time it's broken down by specific ethnic designations. So the key is a little difficult to read. It's pretty small, but the yellow dots on the map are people who were listed as Yiddish. The black dots are people who were listed as Jewish. Orange is Syrian, and that bluish greenish color is Greek. So you can see that They're pretty well spread out, though there is some clustering around the central district / international district, as this map calls it. Next slide, please. Great. The hundreds of men who immigrated to Seattle in this period were identified as having even more diverse ethnic backgrounds and worked in a wide range of professions. Along with Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Assyrians, and Syrians, the census listed Bulgarians, Albanians, Macedonians, and Romanians who had immigrated from the Balkans. A majority of these men were working class, most commonly listed as laborers, with shoe shiners being the second most common profession. In addition to these low-wage trades, the census lists professions that would have catered to emerging communities and families. Armenians and Greeks living in Queen Anne, Wallingford, and Pike Place worked as bakers. Greek restaurant proprietors living by the waterfront along Pike Street supported the growing Greek restaurant industry. The census even lists Armenian ice cream peddlers living along Denny Way, who must have been inspired by a growing number of children and families. And here you can see a network that connects people's ethnic designations to their professions. And you can see a lot of connections. Laborer has threads that connect to all of the different ethnic designations, whereas fruit store proprietor is only connected to Armenian. So it gives a sense of the labor and ethnic relationships among Ottoman settlers at this time. Unlike the 1900 residents who spent time in other parts of the United States before settling in Seattle, many of those listed in 1910 had arrived in the country very recently and likely immigrated with Seattle as their intended destination. This reflects two big shifts for Seattle in the first decade of the 20th century. First, increasing international recognition, and second, a booming settler population. Taking a bird's eye view of Ottoman political developments at this time, as well as examining internationally oriented events in Seattle, helped provide more context for the forces driving migration from the Ottoman Empire to Seattle at this time. Between 1908, and 1909, Ottoman military generals led a liberal revolution in the empire that reversed authoritarian policies of Abdülhamid II, who had been in power for 3 decades. The strict censorship that characterized the Abdülhamid regime was relaxed to allow more newspapers to open and publish more freely. Restrictions on movement were also relaxed so that exiled Ottomans could return home and people could more easily travel within and outside the empire. The revolution had particularly acute effects on Christian and Jewish subjects. Whereas the military had previously comprised only Muslims, citizenship reforms mandated that Christians and Jews should fully participate in the armed forces. International newspapers such as the New York Times celebrated the revolution's commitment to, quote, pay a valiant army and recruit it from all races and creeds, end quote. Although some did join the army, others chose to go abroad, and one of their chosen destinations was Seattle. 1909 was also a seminal year in Seattle because it was the year of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. This World Fair drew almost 4 million visitors at a time when Seattle's population was barely 250,000. The AYP was originally scheduled for the 10th anniversary of the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897, which was responsible for a rapid growth in Seattle's economy and population, but it conflicted with a competing fair in Portland and was therefore postponed to 1909 instead. This fair was meant to advertise Seattle as an ideal port for trade across the Pacific and to encourage migration to and investment in the growing metropolis. Although the fair's main exhibits focused on nearby states, California, Oregon, and Idaho, and Pacific trade with Alaska and Japan, there were also high-profile attractions from the Ottoman Empire. Next slide. One event that caused a stir in the Seattle press and Ottoman migrant community was an Oriental wedding held on Cairo Street on the fairgrounds. I came across this wedding as I was perusing the Seattle Public Library's digital archives of historical newspapers for information on the AYP. The wedding was advertised as the marriage of a Greek dancer, La Belle Baya, depicted here, who would renounce her Christian faith and adopt the Mohammedan religion in order to marry a Mohammedan man who worked for the same troupe under, quote, Turkish commissioner Nami Salih, who was in fact Syrian. The spectacle drew criticism from Greek leaders, including a minister from the Greek Orthodox Church and the president of the Greek Society. They penned an editorial to the Seattle Daily Times where they launched a three-pronged argument against the wedding spectacle. First, they argued that all men under Salih's employment were Syrians of either Orthodox or Roman Christian faith, and there was no Muslim man for Baya to renounce her faith to marry. Second, they argued that Baya was not even Greek. They insisted that she had been born in Egypt to Jewish parents. Baya responded that one of her parents had been Jewish, but had converted to the Greek church, and that her family had moved to Athens, where her father became a subject of Greece. Finally, the editorial argued that if Baya, quote, were really a Greek girl, she never would have changed her religion and nationality to become a Mohammedan for a fortune, end quote. The article ends by denouncing this, quote, broad comedy of the Christian religion projected by Mr. Salih only to deceive the people with this lure to entice them into the streets of Cairo and to fill his pockets with dollars, end quote. This episode shows how fungible but also closely guarded the boundaries of identity may have been among Seattle's Ottoman and Ottoman-adjacent settlers at the time. Muslim identity was claimed by performers as a means of making themselves more recognizably exotic to their audiences and sparking interest in unfamiliar rituals. Greek community leaders rejected this attempt to orientalize oneself for profit and guarded Christian identity as both a religious and national belonging. But the Greek dancer defied categorization. Greek leaders labeled her as Egyptian and Jewish, while also criticizing her grasp of the Greek language so that her performance of conversion to Islam would not implicate them or undermine their identity. Nevertheless, the fact that all of these people, both performers and commentators, had detailed information about the backgrounds of each of the performers suggests significant interaction among these groups and conversations in which they would share their backgrounds, birthplaces, and notions of belonging. Next slide. Although learning about people that made the same journey that I have from Turkey to Seattle over 100 years ago has been exhilarating, I have also been saddened to learn about the severe impacts that this growth and settlement has had on the natural environment and the Duwamish and other Coast Salish peoples who have lived on and cared for these lands and waters for thousands of years. The tidal flats that had housed shellfish and the hills that overlook these flats were subject to aggressive regrading projects, which leveled the area now called Belltown and filled in the waterfront we now know as Elliott Bay during the first decade of the 20th century. Indigenous symbols and practices were co-opted into advertising the growing metropolis, and events such as the AYP exposition, whose fairgrounds were later transformed into UW's Seattle campus, as longhouses were erased from the landscape. Racial segregation in the housing market increased, with covenants and other policies restricting the areas in which Black, Asian, and Jewish residents could live and limiting some people of color, particularly Black Seattleites, to buying and renting homes in the Central District. Here I've listed some of the books that helped me understand this history better and books that I highly encourage you to look into as well. Quintard Taylor, for example, was a professor at UW for many years. While Seattle's Sephardic community contributed to and was affected by these changes in complex ways, Sephardic experiences have always been woven in with groups from other religious, linguistic, and racial backgrounds. My dive into historical census records revealed to me the different identities that Seattle Sephardim have espoused over the years: Spanish speaker, fishmonger, shoe shiner, dressmaker, Jewish, and even Turkish. But I also learned that these identities always intersected with other groups, whether they were fellow Ottoman settlers, multilingual Turkish speakers, or neighbors in the Central District. As I finalize and begin to share my map of Seattle's first Ottoman settlers, I hope that broader audiences in Seattle and beyond will also start to recognize these relationships. Although stories that traverse these different identity groups are not passed down as readily, searching for these connections can show how our identities change over time and open up new ways of thinking about our collective past. Thank you.